Usually when we talk about a system of fact-finding, there is this, like, expectation of pure logic.
Right, yeah, like a rigid structure.
Exactly. Think of a math equation. You have your variables, you add them up, and the sum just sits there on the chalkboard, completely undeniable.
Yeah, 2 plus 2 is 4. There is no debating it.
Right. You look at the equation, and it's clean. There's a comforting finality to it. I mean, we as humans desperately like things to be categorical and visible.
We really do. But then you take a step into the world of the American adversarial justice system, and you introduce human psychology into that equation.
Oh, boy, yeah.
Suddenly, that neat chalkboard is completely covered in competing narratives. The numbers are replaced by, emotions and historical biases and, well, storytelling.
It gets messy really fast.
Exactly. We are looking at a landscape of decision-making that is incredibly murky.
It becomes the absolute definition of psychological muddy waters. And, for you, the listener, you are constantly asked to navigate these waters every single time you read a headline or hear a statistic.
Every single day.
Right. So today, we are going to drop you right into the deepest, muddiest waters in modern history. We were taking a comprehensive look at an absolute cultural and legal earthquake, which is the O.J. Simpson murder trial.
And we really want to stress, we aren't just going to rehash the sensationalism here.
No, definitely not. We have a fascinating stack of sources for today's dive. We've got a meticulously detailed chronology of the trials, a comprehensive historical breakdown of the case and its whole aftermath, and an incredible behavioral science paper from the University of Colorado Law Review by researchers Reed Hasty and Nancy Pennington.
Yeah, and that behavioral science paper, it is the ultimate skeleton key for this entire discussion.
It really is.
It moves the conversation away from merely, what happened in the courtroom and forces us to look microscopically at what was happening inside the actual physical minds of the jurors.
So here is our mission for this deep dive. We are going to look past the whole trial of the century headlines. We want to figure out how a jury actually processes information to reach a verdict. We are going to examine the massive mountain of evidence presented by the prosecution, look at exactly how the defense systematically dismantled it, and then use cognitive psychology to understand the absolute mental gymnastics of jury decision-making. Okay, let's unpack this.
To really understand how any jury arrives at a verdict, we have to start by establishing the timeline and the sheer overwhelming scale of the inciting incident.
Right, because the jury doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Exactly. You cannot separate the jury's brain from the environment in which it was operating. So the timeline begins on the night of June 12, 1994.
Okay.
Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ronald Goldman are brutally stabbed to death. Their bodies are discovered in the front courtyard of Nicole's condominium on Bundy Drive in the Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles.
And it is an incredibly violent, horrific scene, and almost immediately the focus of the Los Angeles Police Department turns to Nicole's ex-husband, O.J. Simpson.
Yeah, and by June 17, which is just 5 days after the murders, the walls are closing in on him.
Very fast.
O.J. Simpson is facing imminent arrest for double homicide. But instead of turning himself in at the agreed-upon time to the authorities, he slips out of his friend Robert Kardashian's home.
He just vanishes.
Right. He leaves behind what many interpreted as a suicide note, and he becomes an active fugitive from justice. And this single decision leads to the infamous low-speed chase.
The Bronco chase.
Yeah. Simpson is riding in the back of his white Ford Bronco, which is being driven by his longtime friend Al Cowlings, and they're being pursued by just a massive phalanx of police cars across the Los Angeles freeways.
Let's pause and try to capture the scale of what this looked like to the American public. You really have to put yourself back in that moment, before smartphones, before social media.
It's hard to imagine now.
It is. This wasn't just breaking news on some local channel. The major television networks actually interrupted their primetime programming.
They interrupted Game 5 of the 1994 NBA Finals between the Knicks and the Rockets to broadcast this police pursuit live from helicopters.
Which is insane. An estimated 95 million viewers were tuned in simultaneously to watch a white SUV drive like 35 miles per hour down the Interstate 405.
It was a collective cultural paralysis. I mean, Domino's Pizza reported record delivery numbers during those couple of hours because nobody was willing to leave their living rooms to get dinner.
I remember reading that water pressure in municipal systems actually dropped during commercial breaks.
Yes, because that was the only time millions of people felt safe to get up and go to the bathroom. It was a shared, almost hypnotic experience.
And according to our sources, that specific hypnotic experience essentially birthed modern reality television.
Mostly.
It single-handedly revived the daytime court show genre. The public appetite that was manufactured during that Bronco chase laid the groundwork for entirely new genres of entertainment.
Right. Shows like Judge Judy and the massive true crime documentary boom, they owe a massive debt to the public conditioning created by this exact case.
The nation became so entirely captivated, so glued to their television screens day after day as the legal proceedings began, that one economic research company estimated a $40 billion loss in national productivity.
40 billion.
Just simply because employees across the country were watching the trial instead of actually working.
The media saturation was entirely unprecedented in American history. It wasn't just news. It was a ubiquitous cultural atmosphere.
The details of that media coverage are surreal when you look back at them with a modern lens. I mean, you had late-night comedy shows treating a brutal double homicide like a situational comedy.
Oh, yeah, Jay Leno.
Exactly. Jay Leno famously had a recurring sketch on The Tonight Show featuring a troupe of dancers called the Dancing Ifits.
And they were all dressed up like the presiding judge, Lancito.
Dancing around on late-night TV. And outside the courthouse in downtown Los Angeles, the media encampment of satellite trucks, reporters, and onlookers was so massive and so permanent that it was literally dubbed Camp OJ by the city.
But the media's role wasn't merely observational or, comedic. It began to directly alter the psychological atmosphere of the case long before a jury was ever seated.
How so? Give us an example.
Well, consider what happened on June 27, 1994. Time magazine published a cover story about the case featuring Simpson's LAPD mugshot.
Okay, pretty standard.
But it wasn't. The magazine's art department had intentionally darkened the image. They added shadows, increased the contrast, and made his skin appear significantly darker and rougher.
Wow.
And when you compared it to the Newsweek cover released on the exact same day, on the exact same newsstands, which used the original unaltered, fully lit photograph, the visual difference was jarring.
It prompted widespread accusations of racism, right, and yellow journalism.
Yes. Critics rightly pointed out that Time had manipulated the photo to make Simpson look more sinister, more menacing. They were leaning into deeply ingrained racist tropes of the quote-unquote dangerous black male.
Time eventually had to issue a public apology for that, claiming it was just an artistic choice, but the damage was already done. Think about how that primes the public consciousness. This shows how supercharged and racially polarized the environment was before the trial even officially began.
And that supercharged, highly lucrative media environment actually began to actively damage the prosecution's case in tangible legal ways.
Right.
This brings us to a phenomenon we could call the trial before the trial. There was crucial, highly incriminating evidence that the jury never got to hear.
This is one of the most baffling prints of the sources to me. How does a prosecutor just lose evidence?
It wasn't lost due to police error or legal technicalities. It was lost because of the tabloid economy.
The tabloid economy.
The system of justice relies on witnesses coming forward and testifying under oath, right? But suddenly, there was a massive financial incentive to bypass the courtroom entirely and go straight to the entertainment industry.
Okay, give me an example from the sources.
Well, there was a woman named Jill Shively. She testified to a grand jury that on the night of the murders, right around the estimated time of death, she saw a white Ford Bronco speeding away from the vicinity of Bundy Drive.
Wow.
She testified it was in such a frantic hurry that it almost crashed into another car at an intersection. She even stated she recognized O.J. Simpson's voice yelling from the vehicle.
Okay, that is a devastating piece of eyewitness testimony. It literally places the prime suspect fleeing the immediate scene of the crime at the exact time of the murders.
It is a prosecutor's dream. However, Shively sold her story to the television tabloid show, Hard Copy, for $5,000.
For $5,000.
Yes. And once she did that, the prosecutors had a severe problem. By accepting money from a tabloid, her credibility as an impartial, civic-minded witness was completely compromised.
Because the defense would just tear her apart on the stand, right? Arguing she was just making things up for television money.
Exactly. The prosecution felt her appearance would do more harm than good, so they declined to use her testimony at the actual trial.
So, for $5,000, a cornerstone eyewitness is completely erased from the jury's reality.
And she wasn't the only one. Then you look at Jose Camacho.
The knife salesman.
Right, he was a salesman working at a cutlery store. He had physical receipts showing that O.J. Simpson had entered his store and purchased a 12-inch stiletto knife just 6 weeks before the murders.
6 weeks?
And the county coroner had already determined that a heavy, single-edged knife, very similar to a stiletto, could have caused the fatal stab wounds to Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman.
A 12-inch stiletto knife bought by the suspect right before the murders. Again, this feels like an automatic conviction if you present it to a jury.
But Camacho followed the exact same path. He sold his story and the information about the receipt to the National Enquirer for $12,500.
Unbelievable.
Just like with Chevrolet. Once he cashed that tabloid check, the prosecution knew his credibility was poisoned. The jury never heard a single word about the stiletto knife purchased from him.
Let me push back on this a little bit because I am really trying to process the mechanics of a justice system operating under these conditions.
Sure.
Comparing the early days of this trial to a chaotic Hollywood movie set feels almost too light, but it's like everyone is vying for a speaking role and trying to get paid for their cameo.
That's a good way to put it.
But if the prosecution is already losing key witnesses to supermarket tabloids and entertainment shows before opening statements even begin, doesn't that immediately poison the well for a fair trial? How can the justice system function if the raw materials of truth are being bought up and compromised by the highest bidder?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of legal strategy, it demonstrates exactly how vulnerable the judicial process is to the external culture of capitalism and media.
Right.
A trial is supposed to be a hermetically sealed environment where only verified facts are allowed in. But when witnesses realize their memories have a market value outside of that sealed environment, the prosecution's ability to construct a complete, factual narrative is severely handicapped.
The chain of custody for the truth is broken.
Exactly. And as we will explore in depth later regarding cognitive psychology, missing pieces in a narrative are extraordinarily dangerous when you are trying to convince a jury.
So the prosecution is essentially limping into the courtroom, having already amputated key parts of their case.
Yeah.
But despite losing those witnesses, the district attorney's office still believed they had an absolutely insurmountable case.
They really did.
They confidently told the press they had built a mountain of evidence. Let's meticulously look at how they constructed that mountain, starting with the foundation, the motive.
The prosecution's core theory regarding motive was rooted deeply and exclusively in a history of severe domestic violence.
Okay.
They argued that the murders were not a random robbery gone wrong, but rather the culmination of years of systemic abuse. They framed the killings of Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman as a, quote, final act of control by an enraged, obsessively jealous ex-husband who realized he could no longer dictate his ex-wife's life.
And they had harrowing, visceral audio evidence to support this. They opened their case by playing a 9/11 tape from January 1st, 1999. This wasn't just witness testimony, this was a primary source. You can hear Nicole Brown on the recording expressing absolute terror that Simpson is going to physically harm her. You can hear the panic in her voice, and you can distinctly hear him yelling in the background.
And it gets worse. The officer who responded to that specific 1989 911 call, Detective John Edwards, took the stand.
Oh.
He testified that when he arrived at the residence, a severely beaten door, Nicole ran out from the bushes where she had been hiding in the dark.
Oh, wow.
She was screaming, "He's going to kill me!" The prosecution presented photographs to the jury showing her battered, bruised face from that night. This wasn't just an allegation. This incident had actually led to Simpson's formal arrest, and he subsequently entered a no-contest plea to a charge of spousal abuse.
So the prosecution is laying down a clear, legally documented pattern of severe escalating abuse. It seems like the perfect logical foundation for a murder motive.
It does.
But according to the chronologies in our sources, midway through the trial, the prosecution completely drops the domestic violence angle. They essentially stop talking about it. Why would they abandon the very core of their motive?
It came down to their reading of the jury's psychology and a specific, highly alarming incident involving a juror named Jeanette Harris.
What happened with her?
She was dismissed from the jury panel in April 1995. Judge Lancito dismissed her after learning she had failed to disclose during jury selection that she herself had been a victim of domestic abuse at the hands of her ex-husband.
Now wait, if you are a prosecutor and you find out you have a juror who is a survivor of domestic abuse, wouldn't you assume she would be more sympathetic to your argument?
You would think so.
You would think she would look at Nicole Brown and see herself and immediately understand the dynamics of an abusive relationship escalating to murder.
That was the initial, seemingly logical assumption made by many legal analysts. But human psychology rarely follows simple, linear paths. After she was formally dismissed from the jury and sequestered life, Harris gave a public interview. In that interview, she explicitly stated that evidence of Simpson physically abusing Nicole doesn't mean he is guilty of murder.
That it's a staggering disconnect.
When the prosecution team heard a female juror was a domestic violence survivor herself, who deeply understood the reality of abuse, completely severed the psychological link between a history of severe beatings and the ultimate act of murder, it deeply rattled them.
I bet.
It shattered their confidence in their narrative strategy. They extrapolated from her comment and became convinced that the jury as a whole was simply not receptive to this motive.
They got spooked.
Exactly. They feared the jury saw domestic violence as a private marital issue, not a precursor to double homicide. So in a massive strategic shift, they decided to pivot away from the emotional motive and rely almost entirely on the cold, hard timeline and the physical forensic evidence.
All right, well, let's look at that cold timeline, because when you map it out, it is incredibly tight. The county medical examiner, based on rigor mortis and stomach contents, estimated the time of the brutal murders to be somewhere between 10 p.m. and 10:30 p.m.
Right. And we can bracket that time with witness testimony. Cato Kalin, who was an aspiring actor and Simpson's house guest living in a guest house on the property, testified that he and Simpson went out for fast food.
Okay.
Kalin stated under oath that he last saw Simpson at his Rockingham estate at exactly 9:36 p.m.
So 9:36 p.m. is our starting bracket. Then you have the testimony of the limousine driver, Alan Park. Park was scheduled to take Simpson to the Los Angeles International Airport that night for a red-eye flight to Chicago for a Hertz rental car convention.
Right.
Park testified he arrived at the gates of Simpson's Rockingham estate early at 10:25 p.m. He noted specifically that Simpson's white Ford Bronco was not parked in the Rockingham entrance where it was usually kept.
That's a key detail.
Right, so Park waits. He buzzes the intercom at the gate at 10:40 p.m. He gets no answer. He waits a few more minutes and buzzes again. Still nothing.
And then what happens?
Finally, Park testifies that he sees a shadowy figure matching Simpson's size and build hurriedly enter the front door of the main house. The lights inside the house suddenly turn on, and shortly after, Simpson finally answers the intercom at 10:54 p.m.
And was his excuse?
He claimed he had simply overslept and was rushing to get out of the shower.
Will you lay those timestamps out on a chronological grid? Simpson had absolutely no alibi for roughly 1 hour and 18 minutes.
Right.
From 9:36 p.m. when Kalin saw him to 10:54 p.m. when he spoke to the limo driver. That 78-minute window is the exact window when the murders occurred a short drive away in Brentwood.
And there was this one curious, fascinating detail about the timeline from the actual crime scene at Nicole's condo. The police investigators found a paper carton of Ben & Jerry's ice cream sitting on the banister inside the condo, melting.
Yeah, this detail is wild.
It was discovered around 12:30 a.m. when the police were securing the scene. The ambient weather that night in Los Angeles was about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The defense and prosecution actually brought in experts to argue over the thermodynamics of melting ice cream.
They really debated the fat content, the specific heat capacity of the ice cream, and the ambient temperature.
All to try and pinpoint the exact time it was taken out of the freezer, which would indicate the exact time of the murders or who might have been present in the house. It just shows how intensely every single minute, every single variable was contested.
The timeline was compelling. But the true centerpiece, the absolute peak of the prosecution's mountain, was the physical and forensic evidence. Because there were no eyewitnesses to the murders themselves, the prosecution relied heavily on the relatively new, cutting-edge science of DNA profiling.
The volume of the forensic evidence they presented is staggering. Instead of just a smoking gun, they had an entire armory.
They really did.
The prosecution presented 108 separate exhibits of DNA evidence to the jury, which included analysis of 61 individual drops of blood. I want you, the listener, to try and wrap your head around the statistical probabilities the prosecution experts presented, because they sound like numbers out of a science fiction novel.
Let's break down the mathematics presented in court. For the blood drops found trailing away from the victims at the Bundy Drive crime scene, which matched O.J. Simpson's genetic profile, the prosecution's DNA experts stated the probability of a random error was 1 in 9.7 billion.
Wait, meaning the blood belonged to someone else with the exact same genetic markers?
Yes, 1 in 9.7 billion.
1 in 9.7 billion. That is more than the population of the planet.
It is, but it gets bigger. For the mixture of blood from Simpson, Ronald Goldman, and Nicole Brown found smeared inside Simpson's white Ford Bronco, the experts calculated a 1 in 21 billion chance of a random match.
21 billion.
And for the blood matching Nicole Brown that was found on a pair of dark socks lying on the floor in Simpson's own bedroom at his Rockingham estate, the statistic given to the jury was 1 to 6.8 billion.
Here's where I have to pause, because this gets to the core of cognitive limitations. I struggle with the sheer scale of those numbers, and I have to imagine a jury of laypeople did too.
Absolutely.
How does a normal human brain even process a concept like 1 in 21 billion? Our brains evolved to understand whether there are, like, 3 tigers in the bushes or 4. We didn't evolve to comprehend billions. If you try to visualize it, what does it even mean?
It is a profound challenge in forensic communication to put 21 billion into a temporal perspective. If you were to guess a number, one guess every single second, without stopping to sleep or eat,
Right.
it would take you approximately 665 years to reach 21 billion.
665 years.
Yes. It is a number so incomprehensibly large that the human brain literally struggles to categorize it as real. It stops sounding like physical evidence and starts sounding like abstract mathematics.
Exactly. Does a number that big actually convince a jury of human beings, or does it just sound like scientific white noise? At a certain point, the prosecutor is just saying a gazillion, and the impact is completely lost.
That is a very astute observation, and it directly foreshadows the cognitive psychology we will unpack later. Human beings are notoriously terrible at intuitively grasping extreme statistical probabilities.
So they just tune it out.
If a statistic, no matter how mathematically damning, isn't anchored to a compelling, understandable narrative, it could absolutely become white noise to a juror.
And the prosecution tried to anchor it with physical items, right? It wasn't just microscopic DNA in test tubes. There were tangible physical connections everywhere. Trace evidence?
Right.
Investigators found carpet fibers that were exclusively used in the 1993 and 1994 model year Ford Broncos, which was the exact make and model Simpson owned and was seen fleeing in.
Yeah, and those specific fibers were found on both victims' bodies and on a dark knit cap left near the bodies at the scene.
That's pretty damning.
They also found dark blue cotton clothing fibers on the victims. Those fibers microscopically matched a dark blue shirt Simpson was seen wearing on a home video earlier that exact evening when he attended his daughter's dance recital.
Wow. Furthermore, they had compelling footprint evidence. The FBI sent their top shoe print expert, William J. Bodziak, to analyze the bloody footprints left by the killer as they walked away from the bodies.
Right, the shoe prints.
Bodziak testified that the prints were made by a very specific, rare, and expensive Italian luxury shoe. A size 12 Bruno Magli, specifically the Lorenzo or Leon style.
Size 12, which, not coincidentally, is O.J. Simpson's exact shoe size.
Exactly. And Bodziak's testimony went further than just the size. He had contacted the manufacturer in Italy and analyzed import records. He testified that only 299 pairs of those specific shoes in that specific size were ever imported and sold in the entire United States.
Only 299 pairs.
It was an incredibly rare item, and crucially, he tracked the sales and found that one of those 299 pairs was sold at a Bloomingdale's department store in New York City, where Simpson was known to regularly purchase his footwear.
So let's look at this mountain again. You have a history of severe domestic violence.
Yeah.
You have 78 missing minutes with no alibi during the exact time of the murders. You have blood with DNA odds of 1 in 21 billion linking the suspect to the crime scene and his car.
Right.
You have specific vehicle fibers, specific clothing fibers matching what he wore that night, and bloody footprints from an incredibly rare luxury shoe in his exact size.
It looks like an absolutely insurmountable, unscalable mountain of evidence. So how on earth does a defense team look at that mountain and confidently say, we can beat this?
They do it by entirely shifting the paradigm in the trial. They didn't try to climb the mountain, they tried to blow it up.
Okay, how?
The defense team, which the media famously dubbed the Dream Team, was a collection of the most expensive and brilliant legal minds in the country. It was led by Johnny Cochran and included Robert Shapiro, the legendary trial lawyer F. Lee Bailey, and a very specific specialist, a DNA lawyer from New York named Barry Scheck.
The DNA guy.
Right. Their overarching strategy was brilliant in its sheer audacity. Don't just deny the evidence, put the Los Angeles Police Department on trial.
The strategy of contaminated, compromised, and corrupted.
Let's look at how they systematically attacked the prosecution's mountain using that three-pronged strategy. First, contamination. They went straight after the LAPD crime lab's competence.
Right.
Barry Scheck conducted an absolutely grueling, microscopic 8-day cross-examination of the lead LAPD criminalist, Dennis Fung. Scheck didn't look for one single smoking gun. He inflicted death by 1,000 procedural paper cuts.
Wait, if Chep is a DNA specialist, how does he attack DNA that has a 1 in 21 billion certainty? I mean, before we go further, what exactly is the DNA testing they were using, and why is it so vulnerable to someone just making a procedural mistake?
That is the crucial question. The testing used was called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction.
Okay, PCR.
Without getting too deep into a biology textbook, PCR is essentially a molecular photocopier.
A molecular photocopier. I like that.
If investigators find a tiny, almost invisible smudge of degraded DNA at a crime scene, PCR technology artificially copies that DNA millions of times until there's a large enough sample to run a genetic profile.
But what's the flaw?
The flaw is its extreme sensitivity. If you put a document with a tiny ink smudge into a photocopier, the machine copies the smudge too.
Ah, I see.
If a police officer accidentally drops a microscopic speck of their own DNA or bacterial DNA into the sample tube, the PCR machine will blindly copy that contamination millions of times along with the evidence.
That makes total sense.
Scheck knew this science intimately. He forced Dennis Fung to admit on the stand that he carried crucial blood evidence in standard plastic bags instead of breathable paper bags.
Why does plastic versus paper matter for blood?
Plastic traps moisture. Trapped moisture on biological evidence in the heat creates a greenhouse effect, promoting rapid bacterial growth.
Oh, wow.
And bacteria contains its own DNA, which degrades and destroys the human DNA you were trying to test. Scheck also got Fung to admit that he left collected, unpreserved blood samples sitting in the back of an unrefrigerated police van parked in the Los Angeles summer sun for up to 7 hours.
So they are painting a picture of staggering, almost comical incompetence that destroys the scientific integrity of the molecular photocopier.
And they bolster this narrative by calling their own expert, a microbiologist named Dr. John Gertis. He testified that he had reviewed the LAPD crime lab's internal records and found a chronic and substantial contamination problem.
Chronic, that's a strong word for a crime lab.
Gertis basically looked the jury in the eye and told them that the LAPD's handling procedures were so breathtakingly sloppy that every single PCR DNA match presented by the prosecution should be thrown out as entirely unreliable due to cross-contamination within the lab itself.
Okay, so that handles the contaminated and compromised part. It establishes that the lab is messy, but incompetence in messy labs only get you so far.
Right.
It might explain a false positive here or there, but it doesn't explain OJ's blood at the crime scene and the victim's blood in OJ's car and bedroom. To explain away all of that interwoven evidence, you need something much more sinister than a hot police fan.
You do.
Which brings us to the third C, corrupted, the active conspiracy theory.
The defense made a wild, highly controversial, but ultimately highly effective claim. They argued that corrupt police officers actively and maliciously planted evidence to frame O.J. Simpson for the murders.
They literally accused sworn LAPD officers of walking around with vials of the suspect's blood and splashing it on gates and socks.
Precisely. And a key scientific battleground for this explosive theory was the EDTA defense.
EDTA?
Yes, EDTA is a synthetic chemical compound. It acts as an anticoagulant and a preservative. When police draw a reference sample of blood from a suspect to use for comparison, which they did with Simpson, they store it in specific glass test tubes that have purple stoppers.
Okay, the purple top tubes.
Those purple top tubes are preloaded with EDTA to keep the blood liquid and preserved.
So the logic here is, if forensic scientists find the chemical EDTA inside a blood drop at the crime scene, it proves that the blood didn't bleed naturally from a human body during a fight.
Right.
It proves that the blood originated from a police test tube.
That was the cornerstone of the defense's argument. They alleged that the blood drop found on the back gate at the Bundy crime scene and the victim's blood found on the socks in Simpson's bedroom were both planted by police using reference files.
Wow.
To prove it, they called a forensic toxicologist named Frederick Reiters. Reiters testified that he ran complex tests and found elevated, unnatural levels of EDTA in those specific evidence samples, suggesting they were indeed planted from the police reference files.
But the prosecution fought back on this science, didn't they? They didn't just accept that their evidence was spiked with preservatives.
They fought back aggressively. The prosecution cross-examined Reiters and demonstrated that he had fundamentally misread the EPA scientific article he was using as his baseline data.
Ouch.
Furthermore, they called a senior FBI agent, Roger Martz, to the stand. Martz ran his own sophisticated tests and testified that the defense's science was flawed. He explained that EDTA is actually found naturally in trace amounts in the environment and even in unpreserved human blood.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it's a common food additive. Martz pointed out that the ingredients in the fast food hamburger and fries Simpson ate the night of the murders contained trace amounts of EDTA.
The fries had EDTA.
Yes. To prove his point, Martz testified that he drew and tested his own entirely unpreserved blood, and his machines detected the exact same trace levels of EDTA that were found in the crime scene evidence.
So the science on the chemical police frame-up was heavily disputed, if not entirely debunked by the FBI.
Pretty much.
But the defense team was smart. They didn't just rely on arguing over parts per million of preservatives and test tubes. They needed a human face for this conspiracy. They relied on personnel. Specifically, an LAPD detective named Mark Furman.
Mark Furman was the detective who supposedly found the bloody right-handed glove lying on a pathway at Simpson's Rockingham estate in the middle of the night.
The famous glove.
Yes, the defense zeroed in on him, making him the architect of the entire racist frame-up.
This leads to what is arguably one of the most explosive, jaw-dropping moments in legal history. F. Lee Bailey is cross-examining Detective Furman. Right.
Bailey asks Furman directly, under oath, if he has used a specific, highly offensive racial slur in the past 10 years. Furman looks at the jury and calmly says no.
The defense was waiting for that exact denial. Because shortly after, they produced the infamous Furman tapes.
The tapes.
These were audio cassette tapes recorded over several years by a screenwriter who was interviewing Furman for a fictional police script. On these tapes, Furman is heard repeatedly, casually, using that exact racial slur.
That's awful.
Even worse for the prosecution, he is recorded boasting about police brutality, fabricating probable cause, and actively planting evidence to frame suspects he believed were guilty.
It is a catastrophic, unrecoverable blow to the prosecution's credibility. It doesn't just prove their key witness is a virulent racist, it proves he just committed blatant perjury in front of the jury.
And the legal devastation gets worse. After the tapes are played, Furman is eventually called back to the witness stand by the defense team.
The jury is absent from the room, but the television cameras are rolling, broadcasting to the world. F. Lee Bailey's co-counsel, Gerald Woolman, asks Furman a series of questions, culminating in the ultimate question.
It was.
Did you plant or manufacture any evidence in this case?
And Furman, sitting on the stand, invokes his constitutional rights. He pleads the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination.
For the defense team, it was the ultimate theatrical vindication of their corruption theory. The lead detective, the man who miraculously found the key piece of physical evidence linking the suspect to the crime, just took the Fifth Amendment when asked point blank if he planted it.
Speaking of that key piece of physical evidence, the gloves. We have to talk about June 15th, 1995. If people know one thing about this trial, it is this moment.
Oh, definitely.
Prosecutor Christopher Darden, in a highly controversial move that reportedly shocked his co-counsel Marcia Clark, decides to ask O.J. Simpson to physically try on the bloody leather gloves in front of the jury.
It was a massive gamble. Simpson is instructed to put on thin latex gloves first to protect the biological integrity of the evidence.
Right.
He then takes the heavy leather gloves and struggles to pull them over his hands. He grunts, he shifts, and he holds his hands up to the jury, visually demonstrating that the gloves appear far, far too tight to fit.
It is amazing theatrical television, but it is an absolute disaster for the prosecution. I know the prosecution tries to explain it away with science and medical records, right?
They attempt a logical recovery. They argue that leather naturally shrinks when it is soaked in liquid, in this case blood, and then subjected to the freezing and unfreezing process required by the crime lab for DNA preservation.
Which makes sense.
Darden also introduced medical records showing that Simpson had recently stopped taking his daily anti-inflammatory medication for his rheumatoid arthritis, which caused the joints in his hands to noticeably swell.
They even brought in an expert witness from the actual glove manufacturer, Eris Isotoner. He testified that he was 100% certain the leather gloves had shrunk significantly from their original size.
Yeah, they tried really hard to fix it.
Darden later had Simpson try on a brand new, pristine pair of the exact same style and size of gloves, and they fit perfectly.
But from a psychological standpoint, the damage was irreversible. The visceral, visual image of Simpson struggling with the shrunken gloves gave Johnny Cochran the defining, rhythmic line of his closing argument.
If it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
Exactly.
Okay, I have to stop here. I want to pose a logical hurdle to you because This police conspiracy theory, the idea that Furman planted the glove, has always bothered me when I think about it logically.
Or what's the hurdle?
If Mark Furman found the right-handed glove at the murder scene on Bundy Drive, secretly put it in his pocket or his sock, drove over to OJ's house on Rockingham, and planted it in the dark to frame him,
Right.
how did Furman know OJ didn't have an ironclad alibi? For all Detective Furman knew, at 2 a.m., O.J. Simpson could have been sitting in a crowded Los Angeles restaurant with 50 witnesses. He could have been live on a late-night television show.
That's a huge risk.
Exactly. To plant evidence linking a famous celebrity to a double homicide without knowing a suspect's whereabouts is like playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun pointed at your own career and your freedom. How did the jury overlook that massive, gaping logical gap in the defense's story?
This raises an important question, and it is exactly where we pivot away from courtroom theatrics and dive deep into the cognitive science.
Awesome. Let's get into it.
To understand how the jury overlooked that specific logical gap, we have to look at the University of Colorado Law Review paper by Hastie and Pennington. They spent years researching juror psychology, and they outlined a framework called explanation-based decision-making, or EBDM.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics of the human brain. What exactly is explanation-based decision-making?
The core premise of EBDM is that jurors do not act like the logical calculators or the objective chalkboards we discussed at the very beginning of the show.
Right, they aren't machines.
Exactly. They don't listen to the evidence, assign a mathematical weight to each piece, say, plus 10 points for a 1 in 21 billion DNA match, minus 5 points for a botched lab protocol, minus 10 points for a racist detective, and then tally the score at the end.
So they aren't computing variables.
Not at all. Instead, when a human being is faced with a massive, jumbled, contradictory database of information, their brain naturally tries to figure out what happened, but constructing an intermediate narrative.
They build a story.
Yes, they build a story in their minds that links the chronological events with recognizable human motives. They take the raw evidence, mix it with their own personal background, knowledge of how the world works, and try to create a coherent narrative.
So the verdict is based on that story.
The verdict they ultimately render isn't based on the raw, objective evidence itself. It is based entirely on the subjective story they have constructed from the evidence.
They become screenwriters trying to make sense of the chaos.
Yes. And Hastie and Pennington argue that a juror's confidence in their internal story is governed by what they call certainty principles. The three main principles are coverage, coherence, and uniqueness.
Let's break those down for the listener, because this is fascinating. What does coherence mean in the context of a murder trial?
Coherence is essentially how well the story holds together logically. It has three subcomponents: consistency, completeness, and plausibility. Let's look closely at completeness.
Okay, completeness.
A story is complete when it has all of its expected structural parts: a beginning, middle, end, motive, and method. Think of the prosecution story. It was incredibly strong on microscopic forensics, but structurally, it lacked completeness.
How so?
Where were the bloody clothes Simpson supposedly wore during the attack? They were never found. Where was the murder weapon? Never found. The prosecution couldn't answer those fundamental narrative questions. Their story had missing chapters.
Right, and we know exactly why chapters were missing. Because guys like Jose Camacho, the knife salesman, sold their stories to the tabloids and never testified. So the prosecution's story was structurally incomplete. What about plausibility?
Plausibility is arguably the most powerful filter in EBDM. It is about whether the story corresponds to the juror's personal knowledge of what typically happens in the real world.
Ah, okay.
Now, go back to your question about the logical gap of Mark Furman planting evidence without knowing Simpson's alibi.
Right, the Russian roulette thing.
Exactly. To a white, middle-class observer living in the suburbs who has generally positive interactions with law enforcement, a police officer taking that kind of insane career-ending risk to frame a beloved celebrity might seem highly implausible. It doesn't fit their understanding of how the world works.
Because their worldview involves trusting the police system to operate within the bounds of the law.
But you cannot separate the jury from their environment.
Yeah.
I want you to imagine you are sitting in that jury box. This is Los Angeles in 1995. This is a predominantly black and minority jury.
The environment matters.
You are living in a city just 3 years removed from the videotaped beating of Rodney King by LAPD officers and the devastating riots that followed their acquittal. You know the history of Police Chief Daryl Gates and the militarization of the department in South Central.
Oh, wow, yeah. That changes everything.
To this specific jury, a story about a racist, corrupt LAPD officer casually planting evidence to frame a black man wasn't just a wild Hollywood script. Based on their lived experience, their community history, and their knowledge of their city, it was highly, depressingly plausible.
The tapes just confirmed it.
Exactly. The Furman tapes didn't shock them. The tapes merely provided audio confirmation of what they already believed to be true about the department's culture.
Wow. When you frame it like that, the logical gap of the alibi completely disappears. The defense didn't just tell a story. They told a story that fit the jury's pre-existing worldview perfectly. What is the last certainty principle? Uniqueness.
Uniqueness is the final hurdle. If there is only one coherent story that explains all the evidence, the jury will confidently accept it, even if it has minor flaws.
Okay.
But if there are multiple coherent stories that explain the evidence, the jury's belief in any single one is severely diminished. The prosecution presented one story. Simpson is a jealous, violent murderer.
And the defense provided the second story.
Yes. The Dream Team didn't just poke holes in the forensics. They provided a second, entirely constructed alternative story. Simpson is the innocent victim of a massive racist police frame-up orchestrated by the LAPD.
And because the defense's second story had such strong plausibility for this specific LA jury, the prosecution's story lost its uniqueness. And the loss of uniqueness in the mind of a juror is essentially the psychological definition of reasonable doubt.
Precisely. And we must factor in the extreme psychological stress this particular jury was under.
Yeah.
This was the longest jury sequestration in California history.
I can't even imagine.
They were isolated in a hotel for 266 days. Their phone calls were monitored, their television viewing was censored, their conjugal visits were supervised.
That sounds like prison.
It was intense. At one point in April, the stress boiled over. 13 of the remaining jurors and alternates actually staged a revolt, refusing to come to court and dressing in all-black clothing to protest the dismissal of the deputies guarding them.
A literal jury revolt.
Yes. Hastie and Pennington note in their research that in high-stress, overwhelming information environments, human beings suffer cognitive fatigue. They cannot process complex math. They default to the narrative that makes the most emotional and contextual sense to them.
EBDM perfectly explains why they rejected the complex DNA mathematics and accepted the corruption narrative. So think about what this means. Is a trial just a high-stakes storytelling competition? It sounds like building a massive piece of IKEA furniture without the instruction manual. You have hundreds of random pieces of evidence, dowels and screws of data, and you just try to jam them together to make it look like the picture on the box or the picture in your head.
That's a great analogy.
Does the objective truth even matter in a courtroom, or does the best narrative simply win?
What's fascinating here is the paradox of the system. The American justice system is explicitly designed to seek the objective truth, but it relies entirely on subjective human cognitive processes to find it.
Which is deeply flawed.
And human cognition vastly prefers a complete, culturally plausible story over an incomplete set of mathematically compelling facts. The defense team understood this cognitive quirk deeply. They were simply better storytellers for that specific audience at that specific moment in history.
Which leads us directly to the verdict. October 3rd, 1995. After 134 days of televised trial, testimony from 150 witnesses, 108 DNA exhibits, and months of grueling sequestration, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours.
The sheer speed of that deliberation stunned legal analysts everywhere.
Less than 4 hours.
4 hours is barely enough time to read the jury instructions, let alone review the evidence. It indicated clearly that they weren't poring over the granular forensic data or debating the thermodynamics of ice cream.
No, they had already made up their minds.
They had already accepted the defense's overarching narrative long before closing arguments began.
The verdict is read to a breathless country, not guilty on both counts of murder, and the reaction is explosive. There is that famous, indelible moment of juror number 9, a man named Lionel Cryer, giving O.J. Simpson a raised fist salute, a symbol of black power and solidarity, as he leaves the jury box.
And the reaction outside the courtroom, captured live on split screens across the country, revealed a massive, painful cultural and racial split in America.
What were the numbers?
Polling conducted immediately after the verdict showed a stark divide. 75% of white Americans thought Simpson was guilty, while 70% of black Americans thought he was innocent.
That is a staggering divide. It's like two different countries watched two different trials.
As our historical sources impartially contextualize it, these two groups were essentially evaluating two entirely different stories using EBDM.
Right.
Black Americans and minority communities had deep historical reasons to distrust the LAPD. Their focus was heavily weighted toward the plausible narrative of a frame-up, fears that, it should be noted, were arguably validated just a few years later by the massive LAPD Rampart scandal, which uncovered widespread police corruption, evidence planting, and perjury.
So they felt vindicated.
Yes. White Americans, generally lacking that historical friction with law enforcement, found the conspiracy narrative implausible. Their EBDM process focused strictly on the DNA and physical evidence.
This divide was so profound it actually spilled over into legislation. The sources note that the reaction to the Simpson verdict exacerbated racial tensions among voters, which directly contributed to the passage of California's Proposition 209 in 1996.
Right, the ballot initiative.
This was a highly controversial ballot initiative that ended affirmative action programs in state institutions. The verdict became a deep political wedge issue.
But the legal saga for O.J. Simpson was not over. In 1996, the victims' families, the Goldmans and the Browns, filed a civil wrongful death lawsuit against Simpson, seeking financial damages.
And this civil trial, known as Rufo v. Simpson, held in the city of Santa Monica, plays out entirely differently than the criminal trial.
Radically differently, because the structural rules of the storytelling changed. First, the presiding judge, Hiroshi Fujisaki, absolutely refused to allow television cameras in the courtroom.
No cameras at all.
Right. That instantly cut off the media circus and the performative aspect of the lawyering. More importantly, he severely restricted the defense. He banned them from alleging a racist police conspiracy or condemning the crime lab without direct physical proof.
So the judge essentially dismantled the defense's main story right out of the gate. He took away their narrative uniqueness.
Furthermore, we have to understand the legal philosophy of the standard of proof. In a criminal trial, where the state is trying to take away a citizen's liberty or life, the burden is beyond a reasonable doubt. It requires near absolute certainty.
But a civil trial is different.
Exactly. A civil trial is a dispute between private citizens over money. The standard of proof is much lower. It's a preponderance of the evidence. You just have to prove that your version of events is 51% likely to be true. It basically means, is it more likely than not?
And the jury makeup was different, reflecting the whiter, more affluent Santa Monica venue. But there was also crucial, devastating new evidence submitted in the civil trial that wasn't allowed or wasn't available in the criminal trial, right?
Yes. The civil judge allowed Nicole Brown's personal diary entries to be admitted as evidence. These diaries established a clear, documented timeline of hostility, stalking, and fear, cementing the motive that the criminal trial had abandoned.
The missing motive returns.
Even more devastating, while the criminal trial had footprint evidence, the civil trial had photographic proof. 31 separate photographs surfaced showing O.J. Simpson wearing the exact same rare-size 12 Bruno Magli shoes that left bloody footprints at the crime scene.
The very same shoes he had previously sworn under oath in a deposition he would never wear because they were ugly-ass shoes.
Exactly. And the defense couldn't claim these were recently manufactured fakes because one of the photos had been published in a Buffalo Bills newsletter 6 months before the murders even occurred.
The result is decisive. The plaintiff's lawyer, Daniel Petrocelli, stands in front of the jury, points directly at Simpson and says, "There's a killer in this courtroom."
A powerful moment.
The jury finds Simpson legally liable for the deaths of Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson, and they award the families a staggering $33.5 million in compensatory and punitive damages.
In the aftermath of that financial ruin, Simpson's life unraveled. The Goldman family tirelessly, relentlessly pursued that civil judgment, seizing assets wherever they could.
Even the book.
Right. When Simpson tried to publish a hypothetically ghost-written book about the murders called If I Did It, the Goldmans took him to bankruptcy court. They seized the publishing rights to the book and republished it themselves with the title If I Did It. Confessions of the Killer, graphically minimizing the word if on the cover, so it read like a confession.
Simpson eventually relocated to Florida to protect his NFL pension from seizure, and he eventually found his way back into the criminal justice system. He was convicted of armed robbery and kidnapping in Las Vegas in 2008 after leading a group of men into a hotel room to steal back sports memorabilia at gunpoint.
He served 9 years in a Nevada prison, was paroled in 2017, and recently died in 2024.
And while alternate theories regarding the 1994 murders occasionally surface in documentaries or online forums, such as the claim that an incarcerated serial killer named Glenn Edward Rogers bragged he was hired to commit the murders, prosecutors, lead investigators, and most importantly, the victims' families, have entirely and vehemently rejected them.
They maintain unequivocally that the totality of the evidence points exclusively to Simpson.
Okay, looking at the contrast between these two trials, I have another pushback. Think about the messaging this sends to the public. How can the exact same American justice system look at the exact same murdered bodies, the exact same timeline, and the exact same DNA evidence and say, not guilty on a Tuesday, but you owe $33 million for murder on a Wednesday?
It's jarring.
It's like the judicial system itself has a split personality. It feels fundamentally broken.
It feels contradictory until you view it through the lens of EBDM. The justice system didn't change its personality. It changed the parameters of what stories were legally allowed to be told. The civil trial changed the rules of the storytelling. By lowering the burden of proof to 51%, introducing the emotional resonance of the diary, securing a visual proof of the shoe photos, and explicitly removing the racism conspiracy narrative from the courtroom, the civil court ensured that the plaintiff's story was the only coherent and complete narrative available to that specific jury.
So as we wrap up this massive deep dive, we have to pull back and look at the whole complex picture. A horrific double murder was transformed into a national media spectacle that permanently altered the trajectory of television.
It changed everything.
A combination of early police errors, brilliant legal maneuvering by a defense team willing to exploit societal fault lines, and the fundamental cognitive quirks of the human brain resulted in the most debated, controversial verdict in American history. It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that evidence does not speak for itself. It requires a narrator.
And that reliance on narrative brings us to a final, incredibly provocative thought from the source material regarding statistical analysis.
Oh, I'm ready.
We talked about how bad human brains are at processing large numbers, but we are equally bad at processing percentages when they are wrapped in a misleading story. During the criminal trial, defense attorney Alan Dershowitz tried to minimize the impact of the domestic violence evidence.
Okay.
He presented a statistic to the jury. He argued that historically, only 0.1% of men who abuse their wives ultimately go on to murder them. Therefore, he claimed, the history of abuse was statistically insignificant to the murder charge.
0.1%. It sounds like a tiny mathematically irrelevant number. If you hear that, you think, okay, abuse is bad, but it doesn't mean he's a killer.
And human brains easily accept that narrative because it's simple. Most abusers aren't murderers, so this abuse doesn't prove murder. But the behavioral scientists point out a massive logical flaw here, utilizing a mathematical concept called Bayes' theorem of conditional probability.
Bayes' theorem.
Yes. Bayes' theorem is about updating the probability of a hypothesis as more evidence becomes available. Dershowitz's statistic of 0.1% ignores a crucial, undeniable piece of reality. The wife in this case was actually murdered.
Oh, I see. Nicole wasn't just a randomly selected abused wife in a survey. She was a dead abused wife lying in a courtyard.
Exactly. Think of it like this. The probability of a random person walking down the street carrying an umbrella is low. But the probability of a person carrying an umbrella, given that it is pouring rain outside, is incredibly high. You have to condition the probability on the known facts.
That makes perfect sense.
The probabilistically relevant question is not how often does domestic violence lead to murder in the general population. The mathematically relevant question is, if a woman is physically abused by her husband and she is ultimately murdered by someone, what is the probability that the abusive husband is the killer?
And what's the number when you frame it like that?
When you apply Bayesian mathematical reasoning to that specific conditional scenario, the probability shoots up from 0.1% to a staggering 81%.
81%. That is a massive paradigm-shifting difference.
It is. But why is the human brain so easily swayed by the rhetoric of a 0.1% statistic, but completely blind to the mathematical reality of an 81% probability?
Why?
It's because the 0.1% statistic was packaged by a brilliant lawyer into a simple, digestible story about irrelevance. The 81% probability requires complex, conditional mathematical thinking that defies simple storytelling. It requires you to hold multiple variables in your head at once.
That is deeply unsettling because it means we are all vulnerable to this kind of mathematical sleight of hand. So I want you, the listener, to take this lesson with you. The next time you hear a compelling statistic dropped in a political argument, or a neat little percentage used to explain away a tragedy on the news, ask yourself, what part of the equation are they leaving out to tell a better story?
Always look for the missing variable.
What conditional fact are they ignoring? You might just find the real truth hiding in the math they desperately want you to ignore. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you were given.